Welcome, everyone, to the Innovation Leadership Speaker Series with HeroX. I'm Jamie Elliott. I'm joined today by Liam Kelly from NL Health Services. Liam, it's so great to have you. Thanks for joining.
That's my pleasure, Jamie. Thanks so much.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear about your innovation journey and your background and where you are now and what you're working on.
For sure. Yeah. So, like you said, Liam Kelly, I'm from Newfoundland, Canada, the far east coast of Canada. Like you said, I'm involved in innovation. I've been always interested in research and innovation most of my adult life. So, was mostly involved in sport as a child and a young adult. Came into university to play sports originally, wrestled for the university team here in Newfoundland, and then got very interested in sport performance and physiology. Decided to go on and do an undergraduate degree in kinesiology, which led me into a master's of science degree in human physics. Then quickly realized that my interest in sport could be translated into helping everyday people, especially individuals with chronic disease and other ailments, to be able to help them participate and get full function out of life. So then started getting interest in how to translate sport performance activities into helping individuals. Went on and did a PhD in clinical epidemiology here at Memorial University, where I started to look at that in stroke survivors and MS patients. So went in to study medicine here at Memorial University. I would focus on clinical epidemiology, started working with stroke survivors and patients recovering from MS or living with MS. So I started to look at ways to help, translate sport performance and exercise rehab in a way for help them to overcome their ailments. Opportunity came to apply on faculty positions and also jobs here at the hospital to lead the innovation and research program. I've always been interested, as I said, in innovation and research. So chose the journey to go into the hospital system to lead the research and innovation program here where I am today, as the provincial director for the hospital-based research and innovation program.
Very interesting. How would you define how NL Health Services does innovation or how you do innovation differently?
Well, we take a patient-centered approach to solving challenges in the healthcare system. So we try to define value as ways in which we enhance outcomes that matter to patients and look at creating efficiencies within the system through whether that's in terms of the amount of work it requires to provide services or costs to the system overall. So largely speaking, we're focused on patients solving challenges in the healthcare system and employing what we call a value-based lens to decision making, where we're looking to enhance outcomes, drive cost efficiencies in the system.
Very interesting. The value-based care models have been gaining, progressing, I'd say over the last decade plus. I think it's very interesting. And I'm wondering, how do you approach and balance wild and crazy ideas that come out of innovation and how folks perceive innovation, disruption? There's also often a disruptive aspect to innovation within healthcare, which is a highly regulated industry.
Yeah, no, so that's a really good question. And, so the way that we try to approach disruptive innovation is leveraging access to the healthcare system in such a way that we answer specific questions around safety and acceptability and feasibility of the solutions before we go to wide scale adoption of solutions. So in this way, we've defined what we call a living lab, identifying challenges and then doing small deployments with very specific questions in mind before we move on to broader implementation of solutions. We find this is a way to engage internal staff and stakeholders in the process and building trust by generating evidence from a value perspective and understanding that we're increasing outcomes for patients and making sure that that's our North Star. But then also understanding, the amount of effort or energy that goes into achieving that outcome. So using our living lab, we deploy or do soft launches of innovation challenges, and then try to answer very specific questions around safety, acceptability, and feasibility of the interventions to achieve the desired state.
Very cool. The innovation lab approach, one of the things at HeroX that we like to see is we run a lot of challenge competitions, and a lot of them will stem from some form of partnership. There's a close relationship between an organization and some complementary organization out there. With your labs and those patient populations that you have access to deploy in small batches, as you said, are those usually patient populations you have direct access to, or do you work with partners for those? And I guess similarly, do you work with partners in how you do innovation and innovation activities?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. So the living lab itself is within the hospital system, and that system includes everything from acute care to primary care, long-term care, and public health well-being initiatives. So the entirety of healthcare delivery. Newfoundland Labrador Health Service is a provincial health authority, which covers the entire province. Gives us the ability to not only engage patient populations, but also different clinical groups and expertise within the system. So we have direct access to patient partners and healthcare providers and leadership within the system to be able to engage in solving challenges. One of the things that we purposefully do is to build partnerships with external stakeholders. This could be folks from our university, the academic institution, post-secondary institutions. It could be our local startup ecosystem. So, startup people with an entrepreneurship mindset that want to come into the healthcare system and work within our living lab to solve challenges. Oftentimes, we end up working with our what we call our strategic innovation partners, which are often, the big consulting companies, medical technology companies, and biopharmaceutical companies to come and work with us within our living lab to solve identified challenges within our system. So partnerships is key, right? The living lab by itself is a partnership that brings patients and providers together, but then leveraging our post-secondary, our startup ecosystem, and then our strategic innovation partners to solve challenges.
That's great. So, what types of projects are you working on right now? Can you talk about any of the projects that are going currently and the type of impact that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I could give you an example of a few projects. Largely want to lay the context of healthcare in Canada and in most of the developed world is that, access to healthcare is a big challenge. And you see that you read the newspapers and there's people who have long wait lists to get different types of procedures, elective surgeries, long wait lists in emergency departments. And you see this reliance on healthcare systems where people are growing older now with multiple comorbid conditions. And there's a great demand on the healthcare system right now. And really the way the system's been developed over the last, several decades was very much a reactive system. In this way, we're struggling at this point in time to provide services to the population, to meet the entire population's needs. So the types of challenges we focus on are those to improve access to the system and make sure that the population is able to get the services that they need. Broadly speaking, we're looking at ways to, well, just to layer on top of that, on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see there's a great shortage of health human resources throughout the world. So when you have a increasing demand on healthcare services, inflexibility of the system to be able to shift to meet those demands, and then we have a human resources crisis as it relates to healthcare. It creates lots of challenges within the system. So broadly speaking, what we're trying to do is look at ways to make the limited human resources we have more productive, right? So trying to find ways to reduce the administrative burdens of healthcare delivery. We also see that, with technology, people are able to work closer to the top of their scope. So trying to find ways to have individuals working at the top of their scope as opposed to working in the middle or the bottom of their scope of practice are another type of challenges or that we're trying to solve. And then the third thing would be to look at ways to, help empower patients to take care of their own health, right? So be better informed about the decisions that they make and, try to enable the population to take better care of themselves through supports. So in terms of the types of challenges we have right now, we are looking at one of the challenges is that, in Canada, once patients are medically discharged from the acute care system, they either go back home or they go to a long-term care facility or personal care home. Ideally, trying to help people age well in place at home is where we're aiming for patients. But for many different reasons, when someone's discharged or medically discharged from acute care system, they're not able to transition home right away because the supports are not available to them at home or they don't feel safe returning home. So we have a number of solutions kind of focused on trying to solve that particular issue of helping patients successfully transition home. It's a major disruptor to flow in our system, and oftentimes patients can spend 6, 8, 9 days in the acute care system beyond what is required to provide medical services. So we've actually worked with a local company to build a solution that we call Discharge Hub. And what that solution does is it helps to coordinate the logistics of equipment, having home support workers in the home, and also things like home oxygen and other medical supplies that they may need to have in the house. So we've co-built a solution with a local company to be able to address this issue. So once it was built, then we deployed it in a limited fashion within our system and looked at the acceptability and feasibility of this solution to reduce what we call alternate level of care. So medically discharged, but still in the acute care system. Can we reduce those alternate level of care days? And what we've demonstrated is that we've been able to significantly impact those ALC days. And now we're looking at broader implementation of this solution.
That's very interesting. What I find interesting about the access to care issue is a lot of folks, when they think about access to care, at first, when it's first mentioned that this is an issue that needs to be worked on, they think, well, I have access to my doctor. I have access to these health services. And even if geographically or transportation wise that may be true, we often don't think about subpopulations. For example, we have a challenge that is in the second half of phase two right now called Community Champions for Disability Health. And it's all about within communities, how are community health organizations helping the disabled community? What are they that organization may not be focused on disability health, but they may have stood up programs because they recognize that there is a lack of access to certain things in the disabled community. And so we are finding those community-based organizations, and this is with the National Institutes of Health. They're providing funds to help them scale those. And what's interesting about that challenge and what you just mentioned there at the end is there is a sense of or a degree of measurability that comes with that. Being able to measure success with that. And the first time we talked, you mentioned framing some of your innovation practices after the clinical trial process. Can you tell me about how that works and why you decided to go that way?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And that kind of is what we've built into our living lab structure in a way. And so, like I talked before, I did my PhD work was focused in epidemiology, evidence-based medicine, generating that burden of evidence to be able to change practice or implement solutions. That's something that is very well established in the pharmaceutical industry. And there isn't a similar parallel at this point for non-pharmacological interventions within the system. We have medical device testing and stuff like this, but so there is a gap of knowledge. So in the clinical trials world, there's a bunch of work that happens in the preclinical phase. We have animal models that are developed, and we introduce therapeutics in an animal model to demonstrate not just safety, but also the biological underpinnings of how this treatment can potentially impact a disease course. We would do all of that work before we would put it into what we call first in human types of studies, right? And these are phase one trials where we're looking at safety, right? We start to look at escalating therapeutics in a dose dependent manner and making sure that it's safe for humans to be exposed to those types of therapeutics. Then we would move into, once we've demonstrated that a drug is safe for a specific clinical indication, we start to understand some of the side effects. Then we would go into what we call a phase two study, where we're looking at the feasibility of this therapeutic to have clinically meaningful impacts on a disease course. But feasibility studies are largely are many examples of the efficacy type study which you're going for, but feasibility studies are designed then to understand if you can measure the outcome, can we recruit patients into this type of studies, and then to design the study for an efficacy study or a phase three study, which is largely where you want to be able to get before you're looking to widespread adoption of a therapeutic. Usually very strict inclusion, exclusion criteria. We understand what the endpoints are, what a clinically meaningful change in that endpoint is. We would recruit patients throughout the world. These studies usually are thousands of participants that are included in these studies. And then we demonstrate efficacy. Then generally speaking, here in Canada, there is a regulatory body that what we call CDA here in Canada. So we get federal approval. Then we do this value assessment to see if the drug is actually providing clinically meaningful for cost perspective. And then the drug will be listed on a formulary. And even once the drug is in regular use, then you have surveillance of these biopharmaceuticals over a long period of time. So that's the foundation or the bedrock when you look at innovation and new innovative products and introducing them into healthcare systems. That's how clinicians, that's how physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and others are trained from an evidence-based perspective to be able to provide therapeutics to patients. Something like that don't routinely exist within the hospital systems for non-interventional type of innovations, right? So if you have a digital innovation or a process innovation, we don't provide that same level of scientific rigor to be able to make sure that we're hitting the outcomes that we want. So that's building on that, phased approach to introducing innovations in healthcare systems. We've done what we call our pre-clinical phase, where we're trying to understand problem and innovation match, right? So we do what we call technology briefs with innovators from the three stakeholder groups that we discussed before. Sometimes we require doing human factors testing. So testing, how the innovation, the device, and the human interaction works. Sometimes you need to apply for regulatory approval before you can test within the human population. And then we follow very strict type of studies where we look at acceptability of the solution. It's really important that you look at the acceptability of an innovation, because otherwise you can create a very effective solution that doesn't have wide scale adoption. Basically, it's a solution that ends up on a shelf. We can't integrate it within the workflows or what have you. Then we would do what we call feasibility. So similar to what you would see in a drug type of feasibility study, we're asking questions around, and we measure the outcome that we're looking to measure. If we were to integrate it into it, do people use it in a way that could lead to the outcome that we're looking to get? The difference from a pharmaceutical study, the next phase would typically be a phase three efficacy study. But what we generally do is look at commercialization type studies. So from the feasibility perspective, we understand that we can measure outcomes. So we do that deployment of the solution with a desired outcome that we're trying to achieve. If we achieve that outcome, then we move to commercialize the solution within the system and then measure the impacts for a number of years after that to make sure that we're getting the value.
It's a very disciplined approach. It's logical because clinical trials have a very scientific or methodological set of steps, and it makes sense from a measurement perspective and consistency perspective. It also makes sense, I think, for organizations that might rely on outside funding, because to be able to do their work and advance their work, because you have to demonstrate efficacy. You have to demonstrate progress. And having that discipline as your foundation, as you said, allows you to more consistently do that and improve from there. Once you know, once you can measure, you can improve from there and know where you need to fix things. I find that interesting.
That
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so yeah, building on what you just said in terms of outside funding, public funding, it's crucial that we demonstrate the evidence. And one of the biggest challenges that we have within a healthcare system is that we're afraid to fail, right? And funders are always afraid that, we invest in trying to develop a solution and that solution don't end up being what it was intended to be. But answering questions in this way, I'm not saying there's no failure because everybody wants to get to where you want to go, but there isn't. If you set it up to answer a question, if you design something in such a way, you're not failing, you're getting an answer. It may not be the answer that you want at that point in time, but it is an answer that helps you then to pivot to be able to move in a different direction, or what doesn't work. So by having a systematic approach to deploying the innovations within the hospital system and answering specific questions along the way, it kind of de-risks the idea of failure.
Very cool that you've thought through all of these things.